this program, Joseph touches on a variety of subjects, including how to begin a study of myth, the impact of mythic themes as used in popular culture, such as films, the gradual erosion of myth in our society, and the spiritual hunger which has resulted, and a great deal more. This conversation took place in June 1982, when Joseph was 78. We began with a question about the popular misconception of the word myth. I'd like to dispel one of the myths about myths right at the beginning, and that is that we so often relate to myths as being fictitious, untrue, not real. What about that myth about myth?
Well, I can understand why that idea arose. Myths are metaphors, and if you mistake the metaphorical image for a reference to a fact, which is what has happened in the interpretation of myths frequently in religious traditions, and then find that this fact cannot ever have been a fact, you throw it out, and you lose then the reference along with the tenor of the reference.
If someone were to investigate mythology, what would be the best place to start?
Well, that's a fine question. You know, when I was giving a course in mythology, I gave one for some 35 years at Sarah Lawrence College, I had people start reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, because he's a marvelous storyteller. And the whole corpus of classical myth is there. And he clusters the stories according to type. So you begin to understand that there's a morphology, a form that can appear in various manifestations, various mythic tales. And the other part of it is that the order of the Ovid, starting in the beginning there with the beginning of the world, begins to follow the same pattern that the biblical tradition does, the biblical texts of Genesis. And from that you get the idea of comparing two totally different traditions. And then I turned my students over to Fraser's Golden Bough, the one-volume edition of Fraser's Golden Bough. His theories are, some of them now, a little bit old-fashioned, but nobody ever did a bigger job in pulling together things. And with that, you're in. And then I like to say that there's a little magazine being published in New York now, Parabola. And those young people working on that are doing a splendid job. So when people say to me, how do I get into the world of myth, this is not an advertisement. I say subscribe to Parabola, because you get people who are in the subject, understand it well, and giving you perspectives from various standpoints, and the references come out, and I think that's a good way to get in.
What about the presentation of mythic journeys through major films that have been very popular? I think of films like Star Wars, Excalibur, films like that where you have myth portrayed in an entertainment setting. What about that kind of presentation of myth? Do you think people get value from that?
Well, I'm told they do, but I haven't seen a movie for something like 15 years, and so I can't speak from my own experience and judgment. But I think the movie is a perfect medium for mythological messages. The medium is so plastic and pliable, and magical things can happen. And then the combination, of fantastic landscape and possible modes of action and voyaging that we could hardly conceive of in good, solid terms, you get mythologic. I've often thought, for instance, that Wagner's Flying Hollander, the Flying Dutchman, would be a marvelous thing to render it as a mythic adventure. You can pick up Wagner's music here and there, that wonderful scene where he has the living crew singing, and then the crew in the death ship, the spook crew, they sing as well. That's a mythological realm, and movies could handle this kind of thing.
Recently, I talked with, a friend of yours, Robert Bly, the poet.
Oh, that lovely man.
And Robert made a point which I thought was interesting. I don't know how much behind it he was, but he made a point that perhaps the presentation of these mythic ideas in popular films was almost like giving away the secrets, that somehow it
it wasn't appropriate, that maybe it wasn't appropriate to put it in this form, that somehow the real essence of it got lost in the presentation?
I can understand that point of view, and I can see what Robert's talking about. That's to say, you have not simply to look at a mythic development, but you have to participate in it. That's the sense of the ritual. What a ritual is an enactment of a myth, and by participating in the rite, you're participating in the mythic message. And myths don't count if they're just hitting your rational faculties. They have to hit the heart and then be absorbed, and you have to absorb them and adjust to them and make them your own life. And perhaps going from one movie to another like that, the thing's just passing too fast. See, people in a religious tradition live with that myth from infancy, and it builds in, it builds in, it builds in. And one mustn't mistake just picking up a story and then playing a role for absorbing a myth and making it the structuring form of your life.
It brings up the importance of ritual in life, and if one looks at this society, where do you see the important rituals?
Well, there's been an intentional destructuring of ritual in our society ever since the Puritan Revolution in the 17th century, you know. They cut out the rituals of the church, and then finally now the rituals of political and social life are being taken down. When I was a boy during the First World War, every time a regiment left for Europe, there was a magnificent parade, so people got their whole spirit into this terrific heroic action that was going on. And then in the Second World War, I can recall only one parade in New York, and that was on a returned regiment. It was an impressive affair, but it wasn't, the people weren't in it. And then, of course, with the Vietnam War, the other tribe, the one that were against the war, was the ones that were putting on all the rights, and they won, you might say. Look at a picture in the movies of President Wilson meeting people. He has a high hat. And then presidents after that had just felt hats. And then we have the good fellow, well-met president, you know. And this is a reduction so that one gets a sense rather of a personality than of a man in a role representing a mode of consciousness that's that of the nation.
That could explain much of the rebellion and resistance that we have to authority in our society.
I know it. That's what it is. Well, add to that the combination of Marx and Freud, and you have dynamite for young people, because Marx tells you about the exploiter and the exploited, and then Freud tells you your father's the exploiter, and then you unite father with the nation, and you get what we had in the 60s. But I always think of that funeral of President John Kennedy as having been a resurrection of the power of ritual. The nation was struck down, you might say, by that horrifying event, and you got the feeling that this was a nation that had a purpose and had an ideal and pulled together. It was a great, great affair.
That was a powerful experience.
And there was a ritualistic event, that gun carriage, you know, and those were all traditional forms. The six horses and then the one at the side with the reverse stirrups, those are old Indo-European themes. The six horses are the horses of the various spheres of the planet, and the soul was being carried back through the spheres to the high end and beginning. It's a beautiful affair.
It just occurs to me how seemingly out of touch we are with that inner part of ourselves and that visionary part of ourselves. We live in a society that's heavily oriented to technology and an industrial age, the nuclear age. What have we lost in losing that contact with that inner self?
Well, I think that people are now recovering it, at least those that I know are, and but the nation isn't recovering it. You see, the wonderful thing about the Delphic Oracle was governors and princes would go and ask the oracle how to handle political affairs, and the advice from those centers isn't coming into us now, as far as I know. We lost touch generally. People feel rootless because they have lost touch with those depths in their lives and in our nation. Our nation is run really by economics and politics. I find no spiritual goal anymore. I mean, actually functioning in making the decision of the state. It's all economics and politics.
How do you think that happened?
Well, it's a hard thing to try to date, but one is the loss of confidence. I think this whole third world recognition that the people that we were smashing and knocking down have values and rights and ought to have rights at any rate of their own, and a kind of shame at what we've done and what we're inevitably doing. But this is an inevitable consequence of the last imperialistic stage of a culture. Rome faced the same thing. Virgil deals with this. And Goethe foresaw it in the Faust, in the last act of Part 2 of Faust. He's in this period where ground-rooted people are uprooted and thrown aside so that housing developments could be built, and all that kind of thing, you know. Struck me very strongly in Egypt when I was up at Aswan. There was this dam that was built, and the water backed up and wiped out the whole province of Nubia. So what happened to the Nubians? They were moved out of there and put in housing developments. Read Faust, Act 5, that's exactly what is happening there. And so there's a kind of inevitability about it. Nobody's to blame. The culture moves from a deep spiritual impulse, a lyric moment that creates the forms of the culture, you might say, but then more and more practical life comes in. Well, I find it in my own personal life. As I grow older, more and more economic and political details are pushing in, and I wonder where that early quietness was inside, you know, that made it possible to move out of your own center. Your own center somehow goes out, and this is just perhaps an organic process of moving from the lyric of childhood into the practical problems of later life.
Joseph, this loss of vision or loss of focus, as it were, perhaps it may be the effect of a world that is much smaller than it once was, in the sense that we literally know what's going on the other side of the planet within seconds of it happening. And cultures are breaking down in the sense of nations breaking down, that no longer are the national boundaries as rigid as they once were.
Well, Michael, I think you named the real crux of the problem. Every mythology, and a mythology is an organizing system that holds a culture together, grew up within a bounded horizon of people who were having similar experiences and with similar intentions in their lives. And now all these bounding horizons are broken. When I was a boy, we never saw in the United States a Hindu. I never saw a Hindu. Today, 30 hours you can be in India. And it's a normal thing on our campuses to see young people from the Orient. And so ideas are pouring back and forth into the various cultures that had never been operative in their lives before. And so there's that scatter. Now, a mythology deals with, among other things, a culture context. One of its functions is to validate and maintain a certain culture system. And these cultures are in transformation within themselves, but at the same time meeting other cultures. And you can ask yourself, what is my society? What is my in-group? Then you know your myth. Well, the only society, the only in-group that's proper for today is the planet, it seems to me. And this is an enormous challenge to open up that way, give not only yourself but also your culture to the planetary view. And you see people pulling back into in-groups all over the place. And, of course, each in-group has a long tradition to support its point of view. And we don't have a universal social image yet.
When we look at history, do we see historical examples or mythological examples of where an existing culture has broken down and a new culture has emerged that we could compare ourselves to?
Well, you can see, for instance, the Roman world, that was an equivalent time, and the Roman world covered an enormous territory and incorporated a great many types of people in the one culture. Then disintegrated as these different types took over, and you have in the south, Islam comes out of that same domain, and in the north, the European culture world, and then in the northeast, what now is turning out to be the Russian was beginning to come through. So it was disintegrating. But I think what's happening here is just the opposite, that all these cultures are pouring into one great domain and having a hard time. The one that seems to me to be handling the thing in the most successful way is Japan. I've been over there a couple of times, 3 times now, and I'm tremendously impressed. The maintaining of the ideas and culture structuring principles of the old Japanese tradition, and at the same time absorbing the Occidental gift and then adapting it and operating with the same integrity that was there before in this new context. It's to me fascinating. I don't know any culture that's done as well.
One of the aspects of this cultural change or breakdown, as the case may be, is the changing and lessening of the strength of religious institutions as we've known them, particularly in Western culture. What do you see the significance of that? And at the same time, we seem to have a re-emerging interest in spirituality, if you want to pay attention to some of the Gallup and Harris polls.
Well, that's a very delicate and a sensitive question. You see, the imagery and religious life of the West has been maintained by certain institutions. And, for instance, when you have a college of cardinals telling you what you must believe, and establishing the mythology to which everybody had to conform. And then when there's a break from that mythology, but it again moves into an institutional thing. Meanwhile, people are experiencing life in ways that are not those that the officers of the institution understand. And so you have a split in Western consciousness, and it becomes tremendously powerful and important around the 16th and 17th centuries. I think the churches just lost their grip on the dynamics of European life at that time. And now they're trying to move in again. But what I see in America is one of the strongest religious movements or quests in our history. The churches are empty. On the other hand, I was in Boston lecturing with Robert Bly a couple of days ago, and right next door was Billy Graham, and he had an enormous public. So I don't think one can say that for great masses of people in this country, the traditional religious things are lost at all. I mean, you get a man with the power and the charisma who can deliver it, and he does, and they respond. So there is that. But I don't know. I've never heard Billy Graham, and I don't know what he does with the message. But people are in quest all over the place now. The great thing that I think the Oriental teachers have done is to say the real mystery of religion is within you. The main thing is not what happened 2,000 years ago somewhere else, but what is happening in you now. And this is a Christian mystic idea also. For instance, there's a wonderful little mystic named Angelus Silesius. I always think of him as a little man because he rendered his message in very short 2-line verses. And one is as follows: "Of what use, Gabriel, your message to Marie, unless you can now give the same message to me, namely, that the Christ should be born in me. And if it's not born in you, well, then the religion hasn't worked. And whether you call it the Christ or the Buddha or cosmic consciousness or whatever, it's the one message that these different religions are delivering. And unless one reads them in terms of an inner life, I think one has lost one's own ground and base.
Well, if we look at our own culture as a Judeo-Christian culture and we go back to Christ, and certainly he was a teacher of the experience, he wasn't just imparting information, he was speaking from his own experience, and he was really dealing at that level. And somehow the tradition lost that experiential aspect, and it turned into basically the College of Cardinals telling you what to do.
Exactly, and there were varieties of Christianity before that crisis in the 4th century, when Theodosius said, there's not to be any religion in the Roman Empire but the Christian, and no variety of Christianity but that of the Byzantine throne. Up to that time, there were a number of Christianities, and now they're being rediscovered with the digging up of manuscripts. And one of the most interesting, I think, is what's come to light with the Gospel according to Thomas, where Christ, the words are put in the mouths of Christ, or perhaps they came out of the mouth of Christ. We don't know about these Gospels, how much they really reproduce what was actually said. But here, Jesus says, he who drinks of my mouth will become as I am, and I am he. Now that's Gnosticism, that's Buddhism. We're all Buddha beings. We're all Christ beings. And the difference between you and me and the Buddha is that he knew how to live in terms of Buddha consciousness instead of his own little individual interests. And living in Christ is the comparable thing using the Christian terminology. It's fascinating to compare the language of Christian and Buddhist teachings. And when you realize that gnosis is the Greek word for Bodhi or Buddhism, and then read back and forth, Meister Eckhart's another who speaks almost the language of the Buddha. It's in a comparative way that one can learn from another tradition to see an aspect of one's own that one had not been paying attention to, and a kind of a little illumination goes up, particularly since our tradition has been institutionally dominated, and now comes the personal experience aspect, which the Orient knows how to teach to us.
There may even have been an historical interchange between the Buddhists and the early Christians.
I'm completely convinced that there was. There's an exhibition in New York right now of the art of the Silk Route from Aleppo to Chang'an in China. And there were Nestorian Christian, Manichaean, Buddhist, chapels and temples all along that route. Furthermore, the distance between the centers in the west and the east were not great, and there were traffic back and forth. There were delegations from Kushana, India, to Rome, and vice versa. Ashoka, in the 3rd century BC, the great Buddhist monarch of India, sent missionaries to Alexandria. And when you realize that Alexandria was one of the centers from which Christianity took its theology, you realize this inevitably was a relationship. And I see the Christ, when you look at the doctrine of the Christ from the standpoint of a Buddhist, the Christ is a bodhisattva, the one who comes with love to the world to participate in the sorrows of the world gladly. That wonderful saying in the epistle to the Philippians of Paul, for Christ did not think godhood something to be clung to, but let go and took incarnation as man, even as the servant of man, and to death on the cross. That's bodhisattva stuff. Joyful participation in the sorrows of the world. And I think of the crucifix, too much has been made of the suffering of Jesus. There's another kind of crucifix, which is called Christ triumphant, where he's there, eyes open. And Augustine says Christ went to the cross as a bridegroom to his bride. And there is the imitation of Christ, moving into life with that zeal for it, where suffering is only part of what life is. All life is suffering, but you're moving on a dimension that's not worried about that so much as about the fulfillment of a spiritual dynamic.
That kind of brings me to a natural next question, and that is the relationship of that inward journey, that inner search, and the vision quest, that outward hero's journey. What is that? What is the connection between the inward and the outward?
Well, the outward This depends on whether you're on an economic quest, or a spiritual quest.
Spiritual.
But the spiritual quest is always realized through relationships, and those are outward. And what you're seeking is the relationship that opens up dimensions within yourself that are greater than those that you knew when you started. I think it's, Jung says somewhere, the only way to spiritual fulfillment is through relationships.
Well, Joseph, our relationship in these conversations has always been richly rewarding.
I always go away better man than I was when I came.
I always feel like I'm walking down a path with an extraordinary guide, and I can just ask questions about what I don't quite understand, and I'll get the answers.
Well, the great art of spiritual development is asking the right questions, and so you helped me with yours. Thank you, Michael.